Montana Territory, spring of 1883. The morning sky over Dry Creek was already dusted with ash from yesterday's fire, and Tessa Mae Morton scrubbed soot from the parlor tiles while her knees bled through her dress. The Wilsons' Hotel was the only place in town with polished floors and porcelain lamps. It was also the cruelest place Tessa had ever known. She had been working as a maid there since she was 17, and now, at 21, her hands were cracked from lie and her back ached most mornings before the sun was fully up. The Wilsons paid her in leftover food, a cot in the cellar, and silence. What she had once believed was just a hard start had long since turned to a kind of captivity. "You missed a spot," barked Hetty Wilson, pointing at a corner already scrubbed raw. Tessa didn't answer. She kept her head down and turned the brush, her fingers trembling from fatigue. Outside the front window, wagons rolled by and horses kicked up dust. The town was built on grit, not kindness. Then he stepped in. Boots first, spurs quiet, like he knew how to move without drawing attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark hat pulled low and a trail-worn coat dusted with the road. His name was Zeke Traylor, though she would not know that until later. What she did notice was the way his eyes passed right over the polished brass chandelier and landed on her knees on the floor, hair coming loose, knuckles red with scrubbing. He looked at her like she mattered. Zeke had come in for a meal and a place to rest his horse. He was passing through from the Dakota line, driving cattle and looking for a patch of land he could buy with his earnings. He had seen plenty of towns just like Dry Creek, where the rich stepped on the necks of the poor and called it order. But what stuck in his throat was the look on that girl's face, not hopeless. Not yet, but getting close. An hour later, he watched her carry a tray out of the kitchen. One hand wrapped in gauze, the other steady despite the weight. She served a family of loud travelers, then disappeared through the back door. Zeke stood and followed. Behind the building, Tessa leaned against the wall and exhaled like she had not been allowed to breathe inside. She flinched when he rounded the corner. "I'm not stealing food," she said quickly, voice defensive but soft. "I didn't think you were," Zeke replied, hands raised a little, his voice calm. She studied him. He had a quiet way about him, the sort of man who did not speak unless it needed saying. "You work there?" he asked, nodding toward the hotel. "Since I was 17, she said. "Wilson family took me in after my folks died. Said I owed them for the roof over my head." Zeke's jaw tightened. "That how they treat you for it?" Tessa looked down. "It's just how things are here." "No," he said, "it ain't." She looked up at him then. His eyes were a cool gray and they did not pity her. They saw her, like someone who still had a choice. He tipped his hat. "Name's Zeke Traylor. I got a cabin up near Pine Ridge. Not much, but it's mine. I come to town for supplies, but I'll be heading back tomorrow." She blinked. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because I figure you deserve better. You do not belong here, crawling around their feet. If you want out, I'll take you." Tessa stared at him like he had spoken a foreign language. "You don't even know me. I know you ain't treated right. That's enough for me." She wanted to laugh. Or cry. Maybe both. But instead, she said, "If I leave, they'll say I stole something. They'll tell folks I ran off with their money." Zeke's eyes didn't waver. "Let them talk. Truth does not need to argue." She had not been offered anything in 4 years. Not a kind word. Not a way out. Not even a real meal on her birthday. And now here was a man with dust on his coat and kindness in his voice, offering her something better. "I do not even have shoes worth walking in," she whispered. He looked down at her bare, blistered feet. "Then I will buy you some." That night, she lay on her cot in the cellar, awake. The walls were damp, the air smelled of mildew, and the single candle she was allowed to burn had melted to the base. She thought about Zeke's voice, steady and sure. About the way he had looked at her like she was not some broken thing, but a whole person. By sunrise, she had packed the 2 dresses she owned and tucked them into a flour sack. She left the key to the linen closet on her cot. When she stepped outside, Zeke was already there, one boot in the stirrup, his horse saddled for two. "You sure?" he asked. Tessa nodded. "I have never been more sure." He helped her up. She settled behind him, arms wrapped around his waist, heart pounding in her chest. She did not know where they were going exactly, only that it was away. As the town faded behind them, Tessa laid her head against his back and closed her eyes. She had no idea what her future looked like, but for the first time in years, it was hers to choose. Zeke glanced over his shoulder once, just to make sure she was still there. When he felt her arms tighten, he smiled. "Welcome to your better life," he said. And they rode toward it together. By the third day riding north, the sky opened enough for the land to breathe. Snow still clung to the ridges in the distance, but the lower hills had softened with thaw. Zeke's cabin sat above a bend in the Milk River, hidden behind a windbreak of cottonwoods and pine. It wasn't much more than a square of timber and stone nestled into the slope, but it stood solid against the wind and had a chimney that breathed smoke straight. Tessa hadn't spoken much on the trail. Not from fear she had shed that the moment the hotel vanished behind them, but from the strange quiet that comes when the body is still catching up to freedom. She watched the land unfold around her, noticed the way Zeke's coat moved with the rhythm of his horse, and listened to the sound of her own breath, which no longer hitched with every hour. When he helped her down at the cabin, she touched the rough wood of the porch rail and said, "It smells like spruce and wet dirt." Zeke nodded. "The trees soak it all in. Keeps the place warmer than it looks." Inside, the space was plain table, stove, a bed tucked into the corner with wool blankets folded neat. A heavy trunk sat beneath the window, and there were two chairs, one with a patch of hide stitched across the seat. Zeke hung his rifle on the wall. "Ain't fancy, but it holds against the wind." She stepped in fully, looked around, and then turned to him. "You built this?" "Every board," he said. "Took a few seasons. Had help hauling the cedar from the ridge." She ran her hand along the edge of the table. "It's strong." He glanced at her, then back to the hearth. "Thought you might like the window. Faces east. Gets the morning." Tessa moved to it and saw what he meant. The slope dropped away into a long stretch of meadow, and beyond that, the river glinted like a thread wound through the land. Her fingers rested on the sill, and for the first time in years, her shoulders eased. Zeke set a kettle on the stove and lit the fire with practiced hands. "I've got some salt pork and beans. Might not be what you're used to, but it'll hold you." "I'm not used to much," she said, then paused. "But I can cook." He looked over. "You don't have to." "I want to." Her voice didn't waver. "If I'm staying, I want to earn my keep." Zeke didn't argue. He pulled a sack of flour from the shelf and set it beside her. "There's lard in the pantry, and wild onions in the sack by the door." She began moving through the space like she'd been there a week instead of a minute. Not because it was familiar, it wasn't, but because it was hers to move through. She peeled potatoes without being told. Sliced pork with careful hands. Zeke watched her from the porch as she worked, the door left open to let in the afternoon light. That night, they ate by lantern glow, knees nearly touching beneath the table. The beans were thick with fat, the biscuits soft enough to tear without a knife. Zeke didn't say much, but he didn't have to. He ate slow, like the food mattered, and when he set his fork down, he looked at her with something steady behind his eyes. "You're not what I expected," she said. He blinked. "What did you expect?" "Someone who wanted something in return." Zeke leaned back, his hands folded across his belt. "I want peace. That's all. If you can find some here too, then it's a fair trade." She studied his face. Not handsome in the way town men tried to be. His nose had been broken once and never set right. His cheek bore an old scar, the kind that didn't come from a fight started over pride. But there was something unshakable in him. Like rock under the prairie grass. "You ever miss having people around?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "But I don't miss being watched every second. Or being told what I'm worth." She nodded. "I know what that feels like." They stayed at the table long after the plates were wiped clean. When she finally stood, Zeke didn't move to take the bed. He laid a blanket across the floor near the hearth and rolled up a coat for a pillow. Tessa hesitated. "You don't have to sleep on the floor." "I do," he said. "Until you say otherwise?" She didn't argue. She lay down in the bed, pulled the quilt over her, and stared at the beams above. Outside, coyotes called low across the hills. Zeke's voice came from the dark. "You need anything, just say." "I will," she answered softly. And then the cabin fell into a silence that wasn't cold or bitter, but full. The kind of quiet that waits, not out of doubt, but out of respect. By morning, she would know the sound of the stove crackling and the scent of pine smoke curling through the rafters. And he would come in from feeding the horse to find her at the table, brushing flour from her sleeves, eyes clearer than they'd been in years. By the end of Tessa's first week at the cabin, her hands no longer trembled when she lifted a pan from the stove. The air smelled of wild sage in the afternoon, and the wind dropped low enough in the evenings that she could sit out on the porch steps without her shawl. She didn't speak much while she worked, but Zeke noticed how her eyes followed the flight of hawks and how she tilted her face toward the sun when it broke through the clouds. One morning, while she hung a line of washed linens behind the cabin, Zeke came down from the ridge carrying a split sack of seed oats over his shoulder and a shallow scrape across his temple. "You fall?" she asked, nodding toward the blood drying above his eyebrow. "Horse spooked when a rabbit shot out from a rock. Rope slipped, I caught a pine branch." She stepped forward and took the sack from him without asking. "Sit down." He obeyed, lowering himself onto the log bench by the door while she went inside. When she returned, she held a strip of boiled linen and a tin of bear grease. "Hold still." Zeke watched her face as she worked, her brow drawn in concentration. Her fingers were sure, and she didn't flinch at the sight of blood. "You've done this before," he said. "My father used to get kicked bringing in hogs," she replied, dabbing the cut. "My mother taught me how to clean wounds without wasting water." "You miss her?" Tessa's fingers paused. "Sometimes I still hear her voice when I'm doing something she showed me. Making soap. Folding corners on a quilt. It's like she's standing behind me, just out of reach." She finished wrapping the cloth around his head, tying it behind his ear. "There," she said. "Not pretty, but it'll hold." "Didn't expect pretty," he said. "Only needed steady hands." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. "You don't talk much about your people." He leaned back, resting his arms on his knees. "My ma died when I was little. Pa was a trapper up near the Judith River. Hard man. Not cruel, just closed. I left when I was 17. Took work breaking horses farther south. Ever think of going back?" "To what?" His voice held no bitterness. "There's nothing there for me now." They sat quiet for a while. Wind stirred the pines behind the cabin and a hawk cried out somewhere high above. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. Zeke's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "I built this place to be enough. But lately, I think about planting rye. Maybe wheat? Something that lasts longer than one winter. You'd need more land for that. I'd need someone to tend it with me." He didn't look at her when he said it, but he didn't need to. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I wouldn't know the first thing about farming." "You learn fast," he said. "And you don't scare easy." That night, she didn't wait for him to bed down by the fire. She brought an extra blanket from the cupboard and laid it across the foot of the bed. "You don't have to sleep on the floor anymore," she said. Zeke stood still for a moment, then nodded once. "All right." He didn't touch her, didn't crowd her, just laid down with a space between them wide enough to hold what hadn't yet been said. She faced the wall, but her voice carried through the dark. "I never thought I'd feel safe again." He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was quiet. "You are now." She turned toward him, eyes adjusting to the shadows. "You built a home strong enough for both of us." Zeke rolled onto his side. "I didn't know I was building it for two, but it feels better that way." Neither reached for the other. Neither needed to. The space between them held promise, not distance. And when sleep came, it came easy. The spring thaw brought more than soft earth and swollen creeks, it brought labor. Zeke's land, though modest, held potential in its low slope and the way the soil darkened after rain. He and Tessa began turning over ground near the south edge of the clearing, where the light held longest. She took to the hoe with quiet determination, Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands blistering in new ways. "You ever plant anything before?" Zeke asked, pressing his boot into the spade. Tessa wiped the back of her wrist across her brow. "Just kitchen herbs on a sill. Once tried carrots in a slop bucket outside the hotel. They sprouted, but the roots curled like claws." He chuckled low in his chest. "We'll try straighter rows here." Their days settled into a rhythm that didn't need planning. Zeke repaired a length of fence that had leaned too long, while Tessa mended the side of the chicken coop where the boards had warped. Neither asked for help, but both noticed when the other needed it. One evening, Zeke came in with the heel of his palm split where it had caught on a rusted nail. Tessa looked up from the hearth where she was stirring cornmeal into a pot and said, "Sit down. That needs boiling." He hesitated, then lowered himself onto the bench and extended his hand. "Fool thing to happen," he muttered. "You were fixing something that didn't ask to be fixed," she said. "That takes nerve." He watched her work, the way she poured water from the kettle in a thin stream, her hands steady even as the steam rose sharp around her fingers. "You ever think about what you'd have done if I hadn't come through town?" he asked. She glanced up. "Most days, I didn't think past supper. But if you had?" She wrapped his palm in linen, firm but careful. "I might have run eventually, or I wouldn't have. It's hard to say when you're standing in one place too long." Zeke flexed his fingers slowly. "You've got grit, Tessa. Not everyone does." She tied the knot and sat back. "I had to." "But grit don't teach you how to live quiet. You're learning." That night, the wind picked up and carried the scent of damp pine through the chinks in the wall. Tessa stood at the window watching shadows shift across the hills. She didn't turn when he came to stand beside her. "Something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. Just thinking." "About what?" She rested her hand along the sill. "I don't know where I fit yet. I know I'm not what I was back there. But I ain't quite settled in this skin either." Zeke was quiet a moment. "You don't have to be anything but here." She turned to look at him. "You speak like you mean it." "I do." The space between them had narrowed over the weeks, not by declarations but by small offerings. A coat draped over her shoulders when the wind snapped colder, a fire lit before she rose. She had begun to place her tin cup beside his in the evenings without thinking on it. Tessa broke the silence. "You dream about what this place could be?" "Sometimes," he said. "I think about a barn. A smokehouse. Maybe a second room if the first got too full." Her breath caught just slightly. "A second room?" He met her gaze steady. "If we ever needed it." A long moment passed. Then she nodded once. "I think I'd like to learn to build walls that hold," she said. Zeke's voice was quiet. "You already do." She didn't step away from the window. But she didn't need to. He stayed beside her, the sound of the wind a hush around them, and in the stillness between breath and heartbeat something took root. Not hurried, not uncertain, just real. And outside, the thaw continued. The garden came up slow but steady, green shoots pushing through black earth like cautious promises. Tessa had taken to marking the rows with bits of slate, scratching names into them with the edge of a nail. Rye, squash, turnip. Rain came steady that spring, soaking into the soil and softening the land until it grew pliable beneath their hands. The chickens laid more than they needed, and Zeke had begun shaping planks for a smokehouse, his saw pulling long, even breaths through the timber. One afternoon, she found him near the riverbank, kneeling beside a fallen cedar. He was turning a piece of driftwood in his palm, its surface pale and worn smooth by water. When he heard her step, he looked up. "That shape remind you of anything?" he asked, holding it out. She took it, ran her fingers along the curve. "A cradle rail." He nodded once, quiet. Her mouth opened, then closed. "You think of that already?" He stood slowly, brushing his palms on his trousers. "I think about what this place is becoming, what it could hold." Tessa stared at the driftwood. "I still want to wait, not forever, but for now." Zeke's voice was low. A cabin can be a home long before it's full. That night, she brought down a folded cloth from the trunk, the last of her mother's patchwork. She laid it across the bed, and Zeke ran his hand over the faded blue squares without needing to ask. "I want this to be your bed," she said. He stepped back, giving her room to speak. "I don't want it out of gratitude or safety. I want it because I feel more myself with you than I ever did alone." Zeke's throat worked before he answered. "I've built things with my hands all my life. But you gave this place its shape." She reached for him, and this time he met her halfway. They moved together like they'd been waiting, without knowing what for. No haste, no awkwardness, just the quiet click of two lives settling into each other. When they lay down, the wind across the roof sounded like a lullaby, and the fire burned low in the hearth without needing tending. In the weeks that followed, the rhythm of their days deepened. Zeke began carving a second chair for the porch, and Tessa learned the rhythm of his swing before each cut of the draw knife. She started leaving notes for herself in the margins of an old ledger she found in the trunk. Planting dates, weather changes, ideas for preserving squash. Once, she came in to find him reading it, his finger tracing her handwriting like it was something valuable. "You building a book?" he asked. "Something like it," she said. "I want to remember how we started." One warm evening, they rode out beyond the northern ridge to check the trap lines Zeke had left. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the grasses. When they reached the edge of the woods, he dismounted and helped her down, his hand lingering on hers. "I've been thinking," he said, pulling a small bundle from his coat pocket. Inside it was a narrow silver ring, plain but polished. She stared at it, her breath catching. "I know things between us don't need proving," he said, "but I want to mark it just the same." Tessa touched the ring, then looked up at him. "Yes." He slipped it onto her finger, and they stood together while the sky deepened to violet. That summer, they built the smokehouse from river stone and split logs. Tessa learned to cure meat and to trap smoke under wet burlap. Zeke dug a root cellar near the edge of the pines, and she lined its shelves with jars of beans and early preserves. They traded eggs for a goat with a farmer 2 ridges over, and named her Letty. By autumn, the garden had turned to gold and rust, and the cabin smelled of apples and sage. Tessa added a new page to her ledger every few days, her entries growing longer, her handwriting steadier. Zeke began carving a cradle rail from the driftwood she'd held that spring, though he didn't mention it again. He didn't have to. When the first snow came, they stood at the window together, her head against his shoulder, his arm wrapped around her waist. "You ever think you'd have this?" he asked. She watched the flakes drift against the glass. "No, but I think I always hoped." He kissed the side of her head and didn't let go. Years passed. The cabin grew a second room, and the smokehouse held more than they needed. They planted an orchard beyond the garden, and the trees took root. One winter, Tessa gave birth to a daughter with dark eyes and a temper like spring thaw. They named her Clara, after a woman Tessa remembered from her mother's stories, someone who'd once crossed the plains with only a quilt and a pocket of seeds. Zeke built Clara a chair beside theirs on the porch. She climbed into it every evening, bare feet swinging, hair full of burrs from the fields. They grew old with dirt beneath their nails and sun on their faces. The land changed slowly around them, but the cabin held. And in the quiet hours, whether beside the fire or under the wide sky, they never stopped choosing each other. Not once. Not ever.